evening, darlings. It's so lovely to see you at Banksia for another visit. This time of year seems to bring out all the best sorts of people and spirits. Allow me to introduce myself. Polly Brooks Howe. My father-in-law, Richard, built Banksia and enjoyed many fine years here before he fell and broke his hip and died. They laid him out in this very room so that everybody could come see his body. How lovely. Well, as I said, he did enjoy many years here. Riding, playing cards, entertaining. We all had such a gay time those winters in Aiken. It was fabulous. The women, Louise Hitchcock, Hope Island, Helen Knox, myself. We had the most wonderful time. Hunts and teas, polo matches. It was the best. But it wasn't always the best time for some of the women. Or Kamala Beach. She was married to that Frederick, a horrid man, and I am sure he is the one who attacked her that infamous night. He was very jealous and not a very nice person. It is no wonder that Kamala took up with someone else. They found Kamala lying on the ground, blood everywhere, her head beaten in with a post torn from a nearby fence post, her throat slit. She insisted that it wasn't Frederick, of course, but her maid witnessed everything. The same maid who disappeared up north before the police could investigate. Oh, but the valet, the neighbor's valet, also saw something. He saw Kamala conversing pleasantly with a man in a gray suit immediately prior. Probably Harriman, very nice man. Well, the valet likewise disappeared. Frederick was defended by the winter colony. He was one of their own, couldn't possibly have done anything wrong. But he very quickly whisked Kamala away to Europe for the next several years rather than face the police.
Good evening, all. My name is Catherine Mackey, formerly of Charleston, West Virginia. Maybe you've heard of my husband, Thomas Mackey, retired circuit judge. No? Have you been residing under a rock? Well, let me acquaint you with the judge. He started out as a circuit judge in bloody Edgefield. Now, certainly you've heard of that. Edgefield got its reputation from, the homicides and the alleged accidents that happened within its borders. Now, my husband was a circuit judge, and he traveled from town to town, listening to testimonies and trying cases. My goodness, the stories that man could tell, and all from his courtroom. You just would not believe it. Late into the night, he and his old cronies would sit in the front parlor, swapping tale after tale about our local so-called justice system. If you ask me, it was nothing but judge, jury, and executioner. Right over there in Johnston, a man named Charles Cobb was walking down the street, and he met with Thomas Cherry. They started talking real nice in front of a local store, but before you know it, Thomas Cherry called Charles Cobb a damn rascal. Can you believe it? Charles Cobb did not respond. That must have further enraged Thomas Cherry, and before you know it, he called Charles Cobb a damned puppy. A damned puppy. Charles Cobb stood there with his hands in his pants. And he answered to that Thomas Cherry. He said, "You are nothing but a damn puppy." He had no more gotten those words out of his mouth than that awful Thomas Cherry took his umbrella and he gave Cobb a sharp poke to his right eye with the metal tip of his umbrella. Poor Charles Cobb. He took that, he stumbled forward. As he was stumbling forward, he brought out a knife. He managed to slice off a little bit of Thomas Cherry's jacket, but then he stumbled and fell. Before you know it, the following day, the doctor was summoned to see to Charles Cobb's eye, and he assessed the damages, and he thought it was nothing more than an inflamed eye. But 4 weeks later, a month to be exact, Charles Cobb succumbed to his injuries sustained on that fateful day. Mr. Charles Cobb's family pressed charges against Mr. Cherry for the untimely death of their poor Charles, and it was terrible. After the inquest, it was found that Cobb did indeed die of injuries sustained by the umbrella of Cherry. While the sentencing was never published, we do know that Thomas Cherry, that evil man, that rascal, that scoundrel, he collected his soldier's pension from the war against the states until at least 1922. Now, just between you and me, I guess the governor of South Carolina hit the nail on the head when he said, if we over here in Edgefield get into, a little insult, what happens is there's either a fight or a funeral afterwards.
I see you're back. Perhaps you'd like another story? Well, I'm sure I can find one for you. As I said, the women of the winter colony had fabulous lives. We were the toast of society. In every newspaper, in Aiken, up north, we even had Louise Hitchcock featured in Time magazine. Everyone wanted to know us and know about us, but not everyone wanted to be known. Do you know about the mystery woman in the woods? Hitchcock Woods, that is. Perhaps you've been there, riding, walking. I know we all have. Do you happen to know the trail called Devil's Backbone? It runs along the old roadbed of the Charleston to Hamburg Railroad. Men, slaves, freedmen suffered laying those rails. Well, you may not know that off to the side of Devil's Backbone, just after you enter the woods, there's a foundation of an old house. Boxwood it was called, built in the early 1900s, now buried in time. The most fascinating and tragic person to ever live there was a German baroness. She called herself Madame Adele von Losek, but we all thought that wasn't her real name. In fact, the rumors around Aiken were that she was royalty, a German princess related to Kaiser Wilhelm, or perhaps she was Princess Anastasia, the lost princess of Tsarist Russia. We don't really know. In fact, the only person who ever really got to know her was Eulalie. Eulalie Sally, you know her. She was the foremost realtor who handled all the transactions for the winter colony. Anyway, Eulalie got to know her and suspected she was royalty also. Now, how did she come to be here? She was very secretive. She didn't say where she was from, where she lived, who her family were, who her friends were. One day, though, a woman named Mrs. Auer Anker approached Eulalie and said that she needed to rent a house. She noted that her husband was a first cousin of the King of Denmark, or so she said. She wanted the house for a relative, a Madame von Losek. But there were certain conditions. The house needed to be luxurious, but secluded. And Eulalie was to speak of Madame to no one in Aiken, nor introduce her to anyone. Eulalie was simply to help the woman in any way she could. Well, Mrs. Anker, along with her husband, came to Aiken, furnished the house, brought in servants, and stayed for a while to buy everything that the madam needed, including a Cadillac. But then they suddenly disappeared, leaving it all to Eulalie. Eulalie took over caring for Madame von Losek. Madame von Losek socialized with no one in Aiken, except for Eulalie. Every Thursday, lunch, Eulalie would go to the house, and her stories painted a picture of the most fabulous palace. It was richly furnished with magnificent furniture imported from Germany. There were fine linens. There was a sterling silver set with a large crest on every piece. The dining table had the most incredible centerpiece, a bouquet of flowers with butterflies hovering over it that moved. The butler would go out and capture butterflies, mount them to very fine wires, and insert them into the midst of this mound of flowers, so that whenever there was movement around the table, the butterflies would appear to flutter. Eulalie was so impressed, and yet she said it was so mysterious there. There were other servants, a Swiss nurse, a German cook, and the butler, a stern man named Coastal, who wore white kid leather gloves while he served at table. To her dying day, Eulalie was convinced that Madame was royalty. She carried herself with a regal presence. She was beautiful, well-spoken, and she seemed like no ordinary person. Well, one day, Madame called Eulalie in great distress. "Please come, my butler is trying to kill me." Well, of course, Eulalie rushed over to the house, knocked on the door, and it was answered by Coastal. She insisted on seeing Madame. Coastal said no, she is indisposed. She can see no one. Eulalie insisted. Coastal refused. Eulalie left and went and got the sheriff and her husband, who was a lawyer in town, and they returned to the house. Once again, they asked to see Madame. Once again, they were refused. So Eulalie looked at Coastal, looked him in the eye, and said, "We know something is going on here. We don't know what. We are holding you responsible for anything that happens to Madame, and we are watching you." And then they left. Just days later, Madame left town without a word. All of her belongings were crated and returned to Germany. Eulalie was told that Madame had gone up to New York City and taken a small apartment there. And while she was there, she was hit and killed by a taxi driver who fled the scene. Eulalie was convinced that Coastal was involved. Most mysterious and tragic.
I'm Governor Hayes Thompson. I was born in Sally, South Carolina in 1884, October 11th. My parents are Reverend Logan and Lavinia Corley Thompson. At a young age, I went to Smyrna Baptist Church, and in 1906, I married my beautiful wife, Banksia Henderson. We had 6 beautiful children out of that marriage. Robert Bryce, Essie, Effie, Governor Mint Hayes Jr., Dorothy, and Gioli. Well, Sunday, March 13th, 1921, was a strange day. Well, you see, George Piper, who was a member of a prominent black family in the neighborhood, in the area, he gotten drunk that day, and he was out shooting up the Chapman Baptist area neighborhood. I go outside, because I'm a friend of his, I go outside to take him to task for what he's doing. Well, he pulls his gun on me, and I shot first. I hit him in the face. I hit him in the chest. He died of his wounds. On March 14th, 1921, I went with Mr. John Brody and turned myself to the sheriff at the courthouse. I was charged with murder. The following Tuesday, the trial was held. There were lots of witnesses for the defense that came out. There were so many, in fact, that the trial had to be held over to another day. But you see, I was in really good standing with the white community, the white folks in the community, so they knew me pretty well. So I was granted bond. Well, some of Piper's friends didn't like that so much. One in particular, John Rack Odom. John Rack Odom had decided to take revenge on me for the murder of his friend. Well, in the last week of June, I had come home from Mr. Brody's store and get ready to sit down for supper with my family. Now, John Rack Odom, he drove a mule cart. And he had taken a pair of women's shoes. So he snuck up to my house, sat behind a window, just as I was sitting down to have dinner with my family. Mint was sitting across from me, by the way, and Odom had shot through a crack in the window. And he missed me, but he hit Mint, severely wounding him. Mint died of his wounds. Well, the sheriff came out, along with neighbors in the area, and we couldn't find any evidence of the murder around. They were looking around, and they saw the muddy shoe prints, the muddy tracks. They decided to follow them. They followed the tracks around on a very circuitous route, and they found the shoes at the end of the track where you would get on a mule cart. Now, after circumstantial evidence, they found out that it was John Odom who had done the shooting. In reality, he had said he wasn't trying to kill my son, he was trying to murder me. A trial was held, and there had many witnesses came out for the defense and for the prosecution. Mr. Odom was found guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Well, after that, I decided to move my family to Washington, D.C., where I worked and I lived until the age of 60, where I died in 1944. After that, my wife, she moved back down to Aiken, South Carolina, and she died in 1957.
Oh, hello again. I see that you're back. I love spending time in this room. This is our winter colony room at Banksia, and it brings back such great memories. In fact, one of the displays here reminds me of another story that I might share with you. Have you heard of the curse of the Hope Diamond? Yes, the diamond is cursed. People who own it suffer bad luck, even death. It all started back when the diamond was ripped from the head of the statue of the goddess Sita in India. And that curse has followed it all the way to Aiken. The French merchant who stole it in India, right after he sold it 300 years ago, he was ripped apart by wild dogs in Russia. It was sold to the French royal family. Marie Antoinette wore it. We know what happened to Marie Antoinette. She lost her head. It was stolen by the mob during the French Revolution. The thieves were executed. When Pierre Cartier sold it to Evelyn Walsh McLean, though, she insisted that she was immune to the curse. Other people's bad luck is my good fortune, she said. She continued to insist that the curse hadn't followed her, even after her 9-year-old son was hit by a car and killed. Her 24-year-old daughter committed suicide. Her husband was declared insane and committed to a mental institution. Still, she said, there was no curse, until the incident with the Lindbergh baby. You see, Evelyn spent winters in Aiken in the 1930s. Her son was going to school here. In 1932, the baby of Charles Lindbergh, famous aviator, was kidnapped. Colonel Lindbergh begged his friends to help him, to use all their resources to find his baby. Well, Evelyn was acquainted with a con man named Gaston Means. Gaston was a thief. He was a horrible person, but she was acquainted with him from some previous investigative work. He claimed that he knew exactly who the kidnappers were, that in fact, they had approached him early on and invited him to be part of the scheme, and he had declined. But now he would help Evelyn recover the baby for a mere $100,000. She willingly handed it over, and he disappeared. A month later, there was still no word from him. Evelyn went to the FBI and told them about Gaston, and he was arrested, and the money returned to Evelyn. But a month later, the baby was found dead. Finally, Evelyn was convinced she was suffering from the curse of this beautiful blue gem, the Hope Diamond. Today it's in the Smithsonian's Natural History Museum in Washington, D.C., where it's safe and there are no more victims of the curse. I've told you so many stories that now that I think about it are really quite tragic. Perhaps our lives weren't so fabulous down here in Aiken those winters. Perhaps it's best that we've faded from time.